And we're back from break. This is Boles TV, Boles, television, coming to you live from the East Coast of the United States every day, high noon. So when you talk about an interesting topic that is difficult and boiling and twisted and fiery and ashen, you want to try to come at it the right way. Set it up properly. Create the frame so you have a frame of reference and a context that makes sense. So we're going to talk about bigotry now, and it's a terrible, nasty thing. And when bigotry and wokeness become combined in sort of a disgusting slurry of human emotion and bad intentions, you have to be careful how you set the stage. So I'm going to try to do that now by talking about a couple of self-admissions and also talking about how things work in the deaf community. So the first thing we're going to talk about, in the deaf community, interpreters are a vital, necessary part of being included in mainstream culture. Interpreters are hard to find. Interpreters who are reliable and caring and thoughtful can be hard to find. Best interpreters usually come from families, CODA families, children of deaf adults, because they've grown up, they know the rules, they know the code of ethics, they're terrific. And then there are other, hearing people who are just as wonderful. But because nothing is perfect in the world, and Jana Marie, my beautiful, lovely wife who happens to be deaf, her phrase that she taught me that we feed to each other almost every day is, it's better than nothing. And if you're deaf or disabled, sometimes you are expected to have nothing. And when it comes to interpreters, people who are not deaf tend to like perfection in representation. Meaning, you have a deaf woman in a meeting. Most hearing people who don't know better will say, I want a female interpreter to interpret for a female deaf person. But in the real world, it doesn't work out that way. Sometimes you have men voice interpreting for women in a meeting, and it throws people off who don't know any better, and they get upset. Well, why wouldn't you have a woman interpret for a woman? Well, it doesn't really matter, because the important thing is the person being understood, the deaf person, and is the deaf person understanding? So you don't go by gender to create a proper context frame for understanding. And for people who tend to want a female voice interpreting for a female deaf person and a male voice interpreting for a male, they don't really usually ever bring up skin color. Well, Jen is a white woman from the Midwest, therefore, and ergo, her interpreter must be a white woman from the Midwest. In the deaf community, if it's a Filipino woman from Japan, a Filipino man from Japan, it doesn't matter. As long as they can get the job done, it's all acceptable. So now we come to this idea of wokeness. Some call it political correctness. And I'm sort of in the middle on this. And my self-confession is not necessarily related to race or gender, but ability. Let's say you're doing a show, a revival of The Miracle Worker on Broadway, and you pick a hearing-sighted person to play Helen Keller. Now, I do find that slightly offensive, because I don't believe anywhere in the world that there isn't a talented actress somewhere who can play Helen Keller, and they happen to be either blind or deaf, or miraculously, if it's possible, deaf-blind. Why have an able-bodied person go on a Broadway stage, any stage anywhere, and pretend to have multiple disabilities? So that might be my brand of wokeness, and I completely accept that. It's all about talent. Now, if you have one person here who is really super talented and happens to be able-bodied and everything, okay, fine. Put them on stage. But I don't believe that that's the reality. So many years ago, Jana Marie, my beautiful deaf wife, was involved with the Theater Development Fund. And one of my star students at Rutgers, named Mary Claire Mullane, wrote this beautiful article way back 20 years ago. Oh, I can't believe it's been that long. About the Juilliard Interpreter Training Program. And this is a program at Juilliard where the Theater Development Fund would bring in interpreters from all over the nation to come in and learn how to properly interpret a show. And like the final project was, they would interpret a Broadway show with each other, with the deaf advisors, and Jana was one of the deaf advisors who was teaching the hearing people how to interpret a Broadway show for the deaf. And I'll put this link in our Discord server so you can take a look at it. And I, this morning, took all these images and updated them with my AI program. So you can see these are absolutely gorgeous photographs from 30 years ago, probably, that are now fixed, enhanced via AI. And unfortunately, the Juilliard Interpreter Training Program was killed because it was too expensive. But the woman who was in charge of this program was Lisa Carling. And this is Lisa from 20 to 30 years ago. Charming, wonderful, talented person. Been around a long time. And Mary Claire goes on to do this wonderful explanation. These are the people who were in New York being taught and trained by Broadway interpreters and also deaf interpreters. And as we continue on, we see, oh, look, who do we see? The beautiful and talented Jana Marie Sweetheart. There on stage, interpreting with one of the students in the program. This is one of the hearing interpreter teachers, Alan Champion, who helped found that at Juilliard. Unfortunately, he's dead, died of cancer, appendix cancer, as strange as that sounds. Did a wonderful job, gave Jana her first big break on Broadway. And here she is, the superstar of my life, Jana Sweetheart, interpreting for, I believe this is 42nd Street, on Broadway. So now the stage has been set. And now we're going to get into a really nasty part of all of this. And it's very upsetting to me. As you can see, I'm personally, professionally invested in theater, in my wife, in interpreting, in what's right and what's wrong. And a terrible thing has happened on Broadway. The Lion King is now the biggest bigot on Broadway. New York Post. White Lion King sign language interpreter says he was ousted over skin color. And this is where wokeness and intention and casting and ideas become very confused and very mixed up, and intention does not properly meet reality. And I'll read you part of this article. This is Keith Wann. He is an interpreter, and he filed a federal discrimination lawsuit on Tuesday against the Theater Development Fund. You just saw Theater Development Fund, Juilliard Interpreter Training, Lisa Carling. Remember her name. You saw her face. And the director of its accessibility programs. It's not the Great White Way. A white sign language interpreter says he was booted from The Lion King on Broadway because of his skin color. Keith Wann, 53, was one of at least two people forced off the production by the non-profit Theater Development Fund, which staffs Broadway shows with American Sign Language interpreters, after the group decided it was no longer appropriate to have white interpreters represent black characters for ASL Broadway shows. And I read that yesterday, and my fury and my anger was unbound, because it's such a terrible, insulting thing to do. Gordon asked, did the theater have any say in it? Well, we're going to get to that, Gordon. But just the fact that you're the wrong color, that you can't interpret a show, is really the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. And there were multiple opportunities to fix this, and it was not fixed. Wann filed a federal discrimination lawsuit on Tuesday against the organization and the director of its accessibility programs, Lisa Carling. I can tell you right now, Lisa is in trouble, but she's not the only one. Carling told him and interpreter Christina Masla to back out of the show, which celebrates its 25th anniversary on Sunday, so they could be replaced by black sign language experts, according to the suit and emails obtained by the Post. To me, just seeing that discrimination, it doesn't matter if I'm white or black, says Wann. This is blatant, and I would just hope that other people who have also experienced this would step forward. Wann, a sign language interpreter and performer who has been working in New York for more than a decade, he'll never work again. Before or after this, he will now never work again on Broadway. He was offered the chance in March to work on one of Broadway's most acclaimed and longest running shows. But days later, he was shocked when he received an email from Carling, Lisa Carling at the Theater Development Fund, sheepishly asking him and the other interpreter to leave the show, citing the current social climate. With great embarrassment and apologies, I'm asking you both to please back out of interpreting the show for us on Sunday, April 24, Lisa Carling wrote. I don't see any other way out of this. It seems like the best solution. Lisa Carling's decision came at the behest, this is very important, of Shelly Guy, the director of ASL for The Lion King, who I believe is deaf, and I've met her, and I can say, meeting her and reading this, surprised by any of it. Shelly Guy, the director of ASL for The Lion King, and called for Carling to get rid of all non-black interpreters, according to another email obtained by the Post and cited in the lawsuit. Now remember, I set the circle when we started. In the deaf community, it doesn't matter if a black person interprets for a white person, or if a man interprets for a female. The only thing that matters is competence in getting it done. That's the only standard that matters. Race, gender, wokeness, that should all be thrown out. But there's also a visual. And at The Lion King, I'm sure that there are more hearing people there than deaf people. And hearing people may say, oh, look at those white interpreters interpreting for a black play. Well, that's not right for this kind of musical. But those people you tell to F off and DIE because they don't know anything. You have to be strong. The majority of the characters in The Lion King are black actors, and the content takes place in Africa. Shelly Guy wrote Carling on April 1st. Now, right there is when Lisa Carling should have stood up and said, Shelly Guy, what you're saying is ridiculous, and I'm stopping it right now. I appreciate your thoughts and your concern. I'm not doing it. Because, Shelly Guy, do you realize that The Lion King, the movie and the Broadway musical, were created, written, directed, script, music, all created by white people? So you don't want white people interpreting a show that was written by white people. White people writing about the black experience in the form of a family of lions. Is that what you're saying? Briefly, Lion King, Jeremy Irons, James Earl Jones, Matthew Broderick. The choreographer for Lion King on Broadway is black, but everybody else is not. Rowan Atkinson, Nathan Lane, okay. Lion King composers, Elton John, Hans Zimmer, Tim Rice, the director of Lion King, a white woman named Julie Taymor. Irene Meshie wrote the movie and the Broadway show. White woman. Jonathan Roberts co-wrote Lion King. White guy. Linda Wolverton wrote The Lion King. A white woman. Roger Allers, white guy, wrote The Lion King. And here, original motion picture soundtrack, contains songs from the film written by Elton John and Tim Rice, and a score composed by white guy Hans Zimmer. So right there, the whole thing is absolutely functionally ridiculous. And we'll get to more of that as to the why of it when we finish this fascinating story about Keith Wann's rejection. Keith Wann, though an amazing ASL performer, is not a black person and therefore should not be representing the Lion King, Shelly Guy. I mean, what kind of person does it take to write that? Not to just think it and to observe it, but to make that bigoted comment in an email to Lisa Carling at the Theater Development Fund. And Lisa Carling did not do her job and tell Shelly Guy, we're not doing that because it's bigoted and it's racist. Anybody can interpret for anybody, anywhere, anytime on Broadway. That is being woke. An appropriate kind of being woke. The following day after that message, Wann was out of a job and the $1,000 he would have been paid to interpret the performance. Now, the sad thing is the Theater Development Fund is a wonderful organization. They provide interpreting services for Broadway shows. They provide free tickets to kids who are disadvantaged. It's a wonderful organization, and they are going to lose a lot of money because there's no way for them to win this. There is no excuse in the world that can justify Keith being fired because the person who instigated the firing, Shelly Guy, said he's an amazing ASL performer. And the only reason he was denied the job is because of his skin color. So I don't think they're going to sue Shelly Guy. I don't think they're going to sue Lisa Carling. They're going to go after the Theater Development Fund. And unfortunately, rightfully so. Keith Wann said he never answered Lisa Carling's emails or the phone calls that followed as he ruminated on what he should do next before ultimately deciding to take his case up in Manhattan federal court. And I'm so glad he did because this cannot stand. I lost sleep over it, Wann said, adding that he has interpreted for a diverse array of performers, including black actors, and even Donkey from Shrek, without an issue. Not until Shelly Guy. Not until Lisa Carling didn't stand up and do the right thing. So this conversation now expands beyond Broadway and The Lion King. And I've talked about these issues before. Non-traditional casting, right? Big thing. Oh, it's a big thing. Where you put someone who's not a white male in the role of someone who's not a white male role that's not a white male person. That's non-traditional casting. And I've had issues with that in the past. I understand the want and the need, but there's a way of doing it that isn't clunky and bigoted. For example, let's talk about Hamilton, okay? Big Broadway show, big hit. Lin-Manuel Miranda, right? And he's telling the story of Alexander Hamilton and all the people around him, and they're old white guys. Gordon says, how disappointing. And Hamilton heralded as a breakthrough show. Now, if you're looking at it from a historical perspective, you might ask, well, wait a minute. All of the characters in Hamilton, in real life, in history, were old white guys. And on stage, they're played by people of color. Blacks, Latinos, Spanish, a wide variety. Now, is that historically accurate? Is that politically correct? Is that woke? Well, there are some in the community who think it's just fine. Now, let me spin this for your consideration. I have talked about this in the past, about non-traditional casting. Let's say Eugene O'Neill's Iceman Cometh. It's a story of an Irish family full of alcoholics and the dysfunction of it. It's very specific in time, 1920s America. It's an all-white cast of all-white people. Now, there are some people who say, oh, you can go in there and, mix that up and put in, different genders and swap gender roles and suggest that one of the characters is gay or change their color, their culture. And I say, okay, all of that's interesting as an experiment, but are you being true to the text? Are you being true to the story of a white middle-class family dealing with alcoholism in the 1920s? Oh, that doesn't matter. Non-traditional casting. Anybody can play any role. Okay. If that's what you believe, then let me ask you this. We're remaking the story of Alex Haley's Roots. And Kunta Kinte is going to be played by Brad Pitt. And the rest of the cast, we're going non-traditional. We're going to have Filipinos. We're going to have, white guys, white women, no blacks in the show. We're non-traditional casting Roots. And people are offended by that idea. How dare you? That's very bigoted of you. I say, well, why don't you have a problem with, you don't have a problem with, replacing the cast of Iceman Cometh. You don't have a problem with Hamilton not being about white guys and their foibles and their errors, but you have a problem recasting Roots as an all-white show, in an example. And then you're sometimes going to hear this phrase, it's our turn, and be very afraid of it, because you are very subtly, but not quite so subtly, being put in your place. Well, it's our turn. It's our turn now. You had your turn. It's our turn. And now I'm going to spin this one more time. Let's say someone is doing a revival of The Lion King on Broadway. And they decide, like Hamilton, to recast the show. And they decide they're going to use Chinese people, white people from the Midwest. Again, we don't need any blacks, because it doesn't matter, right? Well, it's a show about Africa. Well, it's a show about lions. Iceman Cometh is a show about a white family dealing with alcoholism. Well, that's different. So the all-white version of Lion King? Well, in the woke theater of today, and theater is very woke, you're running out of time. That's unacceptable. How dare you even suggest it? But it's okay to turn around and say, no white person can interpret for Lion King. I don't find that argument very convincing. I do find it bigoted. I find it malinformed, disgusting. And what deaf person would come up with that as a functional theory? That only black interpreters can interpret for Lion King. Now, I wonder if Shelly Guy has, some kind of blood test that she uses, some kind of genetic DNA that she's going to employ in future productions to see if they're all white, all black, some black. How black is black enough? Is it only a visual for the hearing people watching the show? Oh yeah, she looks black, so she can interpret for the show. Well, her DNA is, 50% Chinese, 25% Filipino, 1% black, but she's dark-skinned, so I guess she passes. Is that how this is being decided? Or should it be decided on talent and ability and people who know what they're doing? So I hope moving forward, this is going to be a very deep and wounding and painful lesson for not only The Lion King, but for Broadway. Who decides who gets to interpret for what, and who is making the future decision if you look right? Oh, you're the wrong color. You're the wrong size. Women should interpret for women. Men should interpret for men. If you're going down that path, it's going to be a very dark and dim and terrible future. Because if we're all in this together, and I hope we are, we need to support each other and support the most talented person for the job. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter your sexual preference. It doesn't matter what color you are. That is the idea of equality. That is the idea of being appropriately woke. And these are important questions that need to be asked and acted upon appropriately.